got a handful of topics that Mike had posted on the NER Facebook group. And again, if there's any topic that you really like to haven't seen covered or not in depth and you like that, just let us know, okay? Tonight's trail breaking. What is trail breaking? We're going to go all through that. So I'm going to kind of go through the basics. A lot of you have heard this before. Certainly if you tuned in any of my writing or training or anything like that, we talk about that a lot. I just saw a video from, what was it? I forget his name, one of the YouTube guys. Anyhow, one of the things that he said that was changed his riding was trail breaking. And he was ready to quit motorcycling until he discovered it. That's a pretty dramatic statement. But you know, I can understand why he says that. And first off, I'm going to assume that nobody knows what trail breaking is. We'll start from the beginning. And so let's just do that. Mike, can you show that first slide?
Sure.
So what is it? And I'm just going to use these like it's a, you know, I hate PowerPoint shows, but it just helps with my notes and remembering. But I also have some graphics for you. So what is it? It's simple. Don't overthink trail breaking. A lot of people are like, oh, I can't do it. It's for racers. It's all this other. Just don't overthink it. It's really simple. It's not necessarily easy because if you've been riding a long time, you've got a muscle memory that you have to retrain. But what it is just breaking into a corner as opposed to getting all of your braking done before you start to lean into the corner, which is what, you know, like the MSF basic course emphasizes that you should be off the brakes before you counter steer and lean into the corner. And for beginner riders, that makes sense because, you know, they're just trying to figure out how to walk and chew gum at the same time. So to ask them to combine, you know, finesse the brakes while also counter steering, it's a bit of a big ask for them. So it makes some sense, but it's a real shame when people don't get more training and they just continue to operate, you know, in the way that they were taught as beginners, as very basic beginners too, because MSF is pretty much as basic as it gets. It teaches you how to operate a motorcycle. It doesn't teach you how to ride a motorcycle. So it's essentially trail breaking is just breaking into the corner. And so why would you do that? Well, we're going to talk about that in a second, but just defining it, it would be up to or past the mid corner. Now you can call it the apex. It doesn't matter. It's about mid corner. And I have some graphics that'll show you this. You're essentially stretching out your braking zone. So if you were to think of, well, let me just move to this. The risks are yes, people say, well, braking and leaning at the same time, that's a bad idea, right? It can be if you're ham-fisted or if you choose, you know, to not pay attention to, you know, surface hazards or something like that. The other risk is overconfidence. And I can tell you that as you use this regularly and as you it becomes a real strong tool, sharp tool in your toolbox, then you can actually start to get a little overconfident with it. I mean, it's a small risk, believe me, but most people really sneak up on this technique. All right, Mike, next slide. So this will show you just as a graphic what, you know, the trail breaking basics are. And you can see as you approach the turn, you brake and downshift just like you would normally. It's no big deal. However, instead of releasing the brakes before that first arrow, you hang on to the brakes, you taper off of them. So as soon as you start leaning in, you're already releasing gradually the brake. And I'm talking both brakes. I'll talk about that in a second too, how to do this. Because as you increase lean angle, you have to give up brake force. That's how you manage your traction. Now you can brake really, really hard straight up and down. I mean, you can get it so that your brakes are at 100%, you know, ABS kicking in. But if you combine that with leaning, if you don't have lean sensitive ABS, particularly, but you know, if you add lean angle, then you do risk sliding and skidding. So because the tires can't handle that much. So as you tip in, you begin trailing off the brakes just as you tip in, but you're still at like 80% brakes. Well, let me say, you're going to get 90% of your braking done straight up and down. All right. So all I'm doing is just scrubbing off maybe 4 miles per hour more from the beginning of the lean to the exit. So it's not very much. Now, when I say up here, 30% brakes here, that just means that I'm tapering off that quickly. I mean, this is really, it can be like only like 8 feet, 15 feet. So by the time I tip in, I'm already starting to release the brake and brakes. And then by the time I'm about mid-corner, I'm almost all the way off of them. I'm still tapering off. And you can see the color of the line where it goes red, orange, yellow, green. So red, and I'm going to be using this universally throughout, our little talk tonight. Red is slowing, whether it's, however, it can just be engine braking too, but it's slowing. The orange is a transition from slowing to going. And then the yellow is kind of that limbo. It's really, it's a transition between you're really not slowing, but you're starting to pick up the throttle. So that would be the yellow. And then the green, lime green and green is that you're starting to now really pick up the throttle, accelerate. And the transition from brake to throttle can't be ignored because it's a part of trail braking. Because this is a seamless technique. It's not a light switch. So it's not that you do this here, you do that there, you do this here, you do that there. It's one fluid technique. And when you do that, things really work out well. Next slide, Mike. So why do we do it? So because it's like, well, I've been getting along just fine without trail braking, I think. The fact is a lot of you are already doing this. You don't really know it. You call it, you might call it just adjusting your speed, or sometimes you just screw up a corner. That's really not trail braking so much. That's more like salvaging a turn, a corner. But why do we do it? You get control if you do this right and it's seamless, you end up with smooth and stable cornering, as opposed to on the brakes, off the brakes, back on the brakes, back on the throttle, leaning in. That's an awful lot of suspension action going on. So I'll walk through this scenario that seems to be helpful. Is that if I were to do what, say, the MSF says, where you brake and then you get off the brakes and then you counter steer, you've got some suspension action going on that's a little bit of pogoing. So as you approach the corner and you brake, your suspension compresses, right? As you let go of the brakes, the suspension rebounds. As you counter steer and lean, the suspension compresses again. As you get on the throttle out of the corner, it now extends again. So that's four suspension events, as opposed to trail braking. If you brake into the corner, same thing happens. You got compression as you enter the corner, the suspension compresses, but instead of releasing the brakes to have it rebound, I'm going to hold the brakes as I lean in. Now I don't have that rebound and then a recompression as I lean into the corner. So I'm keeping the suspension in that compressed state as I lean into the corner. And then as I accelerate, then I get one rebound or one extension. So it's much smoother. Now you're controlling your traction without spikes in load. Spikes in load are bad. It's bad for stability and bad for traction. So your cornering ends up becoming much more predictable. Your direction of travel is easier to follow. Just things start to really flow when you get this right. Speed control is another big thing, that if you commit yourself to an entry speed, like again, let's go back to the MSF. If you're determined to get off the brakes before you lean in, and now you're into a corner, well, you better have gotten your entry speed right. Otherwise, what are you going to do then? You have to get back on the brakes in the middle of a corner. That's a bad idea, because now you've got your suspension is rebounded. Now you're going to get on the brakes while you're leaned over. That's a bad idea. So you're introducing a load in the suspension while you're leaned over. That's hard to control. So instead, give yourself more time and space to get the bike slowed and be more precise about your entry speed. You don't have to get it right before you lean in. You can carry those brakes just gradually, nice and light, as you come around the corner. Now, what's great about that is that you get the gentle tire loading, but also and control the suspension travel. But it also helps you to adjust your direction control, because any force that you put into your bike is going to affect its lean angle or the direction control. You have to actually adjust for that. So if you were to decelerate, the bike tends to drop in. If you accelerate, the bike tends to stand up. So when you add, either braking, decelerating, or anything in the middle of a corner, suddenly the bike is going to go offline, and you have to compensate for that. That uses traction, uses a lot of energy, uses a lot of mental bandwidth, and it's stressful. Now, the safety aspect is really is actually the most important part here. It's not about performance. It has its role, but that's not why we do it. It's not why I teach it. I want to teach it. I teach it for the mastery of your motorcycle, the control and all the things we talked about. But it's really a safety thing. So it gives you that more time and space to accurately adjust your entry speed, so that if you get into the corner and now you're kind of like, oh, I'm a little bit hot. Well, you haven't released the brakes yet. You might be at 30%, but you just carry the brakes a little bit deeper into it. You're still not adding, a release and a reapplication of the brakes. So you can actually carry the brakes into the corner a little bit deeper, add a little bit of lean angle, and keep your brakes on. That's okay. But at some point, you've given yourself more time and space to scrub off a little more speed and safely. So that's a benefit. The other one is if you're in the middle of a corner or you come into a corner, you're coming around, everything's going good, you got your speed set, and you come around and then there's like, sand all over the road, or there's something in the middle of the corner. And instead of being off the brakes and then having to get on the brakes in the middle of the corner, which we already talked about is a bad idea, if you can, avoid it when you can, is that I'm still on the brakes. So the brake pads are still against the brake rotors. All I have to do is squeeze a little bit more, and I can now start to stand the bike up if I have to stop, or just scrubbing some speed off can happen just with that little bit, 5% more brake force. And that might be just enough to get the bike slowed enough that you can go around the hazard. If you have to stop, well, that's another thing. You're still on, you're already on the brakes. So the reaction time that we have for reaching for the brakes is minimized because you're already there. Your fingers are already on the brakes. So those are the benefits. It gives you more time. It's like, don't rush. Motorcycling is not about rushing. I mean, even on the racetrack, when it looks like we're going really, really fast, and we are, there's no rushing. There's no rushing in motorcycling. If you're rushing, then you're kind of doing it wrong. Next slide, Mike. So when do you do it? Here's the thing, is that not every corner, especially on the street, is a trail braking corner. So there are times when I have my street training that I bring students to particular roads that are my trail braking training roads, and particular corners on those roads. So you can't really think that every corner you go on, even a twisty road, like I live on 116 and, out here, and there's only probably I'm guessing, I don't know, 40 corners that go from here down to Route 91. I'm guessing maybe 8 of them are trail braking corners, and only in one direction where it goes downhill. Uphill, they're not trail braking corners. It's the same corner, but uphill is different. And I'm going to talk about that. So it's really more about which corners, that bullet list at the top, a faster approach speed. So as you're sort of, wicking it up and you're going into the corners and through a twisty road, if you find yourself, accelerating strongly out of the corner and needing to slow into the corner more using pretty good brake force, this is again more performance riding, then trail braking is going to be your friend, because otherwise at the higher level, you have greater forces at higher speeds. And so you want to smooth out those forces. And I just mentioned before how you can do that using trail braking. Now, I mentioned to my students also that whether you use trail braking or not, we both have to be at the same entry speed, give or take, by that middle of the corner. I'm just giving myself more time and distance, space. I'm moving my brake zone into the corner. Whereas you better get it right, because otherwise you're going to have to get back on the brakes if you entered too fast. And particularly when it comes to like decreasing radius and turns and stuff, which I'll talk about in a second, those are corners when it really makes sense, especially downhill. And that's where we are here, downhill hairpins. So when it comes to speaking of, excuse me, hairpins in general, they're tight. And the brakes, if you use the brakes as a direction control tool, not just for slowing, but you get yourself slowed and you can actually drag the brakes around a hairpin and it helps hook the bike around. The rear brake is more beneficial than the front brake for that. So I tend to taper off the front brake, but I remain on the rear brake for that last, maybe from half halfway around the corner to the last maybe 3/4, something like that, or 2/3 to 3/4, I'm on that rear brake and then I taper off. That really helps hook the bike around. And especially for downhill. Now, downhill, if you're approaching a downhill and you release the brakes before you started turning, gravity is going to shoot you forward, right? Because acceleration causes the bike to go forward in the direction it's pointed. You have to control that. And you do that with the brakes. So as you come down the hill, if you were to release the brakes here, here and the corner goes this way, the bike's going to want to go straight, but you need to turn. So you're going to be fighting the bike unless you hold on to the brakes, because the brakes are going to load the front tire. It's going to help the bike turn, kind of changes the geometry by compressing the suspension to the advantage of it helps the bike turn. So you hold on to the brakes, start to turn, you're still holding, and now you're releasing as we talked about before. Now with the downhill hairpin, I am holding on to the brakes, like I say, a lot farther around the corner than a turn that's an increasing radius turn, or one that kind of turns and then opens up pretty quickly. We'll consider hairpin turns sort of like decreasing radius turns. And if you've seen, I've got photos to show you what I mean in a minute. I mentioned performance riding, like on the racetrack. It just totally makes sense to trail brake because you're approaching the corners quickly. You want to get into them strong, on the front tire, and then you want to accelerate out as smoothly as possible. So for us to go as fast as we do at the very edge of traction, edge of our tires, there's no mistakes. You can't really make a major mistake for sure, otherwise you're going down. So trail braking is, and that whole process that allows for that smooth application of your entrance speed and your suspension is critical. So it's just when you're doing performance riding, I'm not talking about non-sport bike track days. I'm talking about like when we're out there on the regular track days or racing. We have to use these techniques. So they can only benefit and not harm a street rider if it's done right, because it's going to, again, do the same thing it does for us on the racetrack, which is help you preserve traction, helps you stabilize the suspension and the whole motorcycle. It's all a win-win. So here's another thing I added in here, because I was driving my truck today down Route 116. And this reminded me of if I'm making a turn where I don't have to stop, if I'm making a turn like to a side road and I'm maintaining my speed, nobody's coming and I can make the turn, I'll trail brake around that corner. Now all it is a 90-degree turn into a side street, or usually, and at an intersection. But I'll trail brake in, I'll apply the brakes, I'll make the turn, and I'll smoothly accelerate down, the side road. It's great practice. Speaking of my truck, you can practice this in your four-wheel vehicle. I mean, I do it all the time. I mean, I don't even think about it, put it that way, because it makes sense. I've been doing it forever, that when I drive a car, I just do the same thing. Cars like the stability too. It's much less critical, of course. The traction management is much less critical. So I find myself, I actually wanted to think about, well, would this be an interesting thing to video, is my feet, on the brake and then the throttle. And I hold the brake, just like I was talking about on the truck, come around the corner, and right away, as soon as I don't need any more braking, I don't need any more slowing, but I'm controlling this big heavy truck. And as soon as I get off the brake, I'm immediately on the throttle. And I don't mean like this, it's always about tapering. There's nothing abrupt. But I do the same thing on the motorcycle. I don't have to take my right foot and go from the brake to the gas pedal. I've got my hand right here, my throttle and my brakes are right here. So I can really make that transition super smooth. So when I'm braking, I use 2 fingers to brake, which I recommend you try that too. And that allows me to keep these fingers around the throttle body, the throttle tube, and then these fingers can brake. So as I brake, and then as I'm releasing the brakes, I can actually start to just easily and smoothly go right onto the throttle. And that's that transition as around the corner. Let's see, and then practice. When do you do it? You do it to practice. And how do you practice this? You have to practice it because the muscle memory you have now, if you've not done it, it will feel incredibly strange, because most of us are pretty experienced riders, and we've been doing this, whatever we've been doing, for years and years and miles, And why I say this is because, I mean, most of my students are very experienced riders, and trail braking stumps some people because they've just never done it and their hands don't know what to do, you know, in their brain. You know, so the whole body is just really struggling with this whole thing about, you mean I'm supposed to hold the brake past the entrance, you know, past after I lean the bike? You know, that's a foreign thing, and you can't really think through it. You have to practice it, because knowledge is one thing, but application is what makes you a better rider. So parking lot, right? That's a big place you can go to, a clean parking lot. The advanced parking lot course I do, we work on trail braking, and look for opportunities. Like when you're out on a ride, you know, like I say, most corners are not trail braking corners. You know, you roll through them pretty easily, but when you can see one coming up and tighter turns or opportunities, keep your speed up a little bit more as you approach the corner. Don't go crazy, you know. Keep your speed up so that you're not using just engine braking to slow, which a lot of people use just engine braking to slow for corners. Yeah, you know, you're never going to be a good a braker or trail braker if you're never using your brakes. So instead, use a higher gear so that your engine braking isn't as strong, and then approach the turn a little bit deeper. Because what you're doing is you're trying to just take your slow zone and moving it forward and into the corner. Mike, next slide. So how do we do it? A lot of people say, well, trail braking is just the rear brake, right? Or they're confused about it completely. It's front brake, it's rear brake, it's both brakes. It can be engine braking. Now, this is something that most other instructors or coaches, I've never heard them say this, but I use it because we use engine braking so much. The timing of when you roll off as a slowing tool and then transition to the throttle is the same. I mean, the place where you do it's just a matter of timing and intensity. How hard you can slow with your throttle, or how hard you drive out, and it depends on when you're going to do it. But it's always about tapering on and tapering off, on the brakes, off the brakes, on the throttle, off the throttle. It's all about just being smooth. There's no light switches on a motorcycle. You've got to treat all of your controls as though, you know, they are just something that you can control with a very fine setting. The smooth transition of throttle, I've talked about a little bit now earlier. And that's a key part of this, because you have to, as you're leaning in, you're on the brakes, you're starting to lean in, you're starting to release the brakes. If you were to just release the brakes and now you're coasting, it's better to start to pick up the throttle. Anytime you can reduce the amount of coasting you do, which coasting is just, it's engine braking, I get it, but it's sort of like it's in limbo. You're not quite, you're just letting the bike kind of freewheel through the turn. Somebody had a question a while ago about, should I squeeze the clutch in the corners? Never, unless you have to come to a stop or upshift. But the clutch is not part of the proper cornering technique. It's a part of the approach. You get into the correct gear that allows you to drive out of the corner. I mean, if you mess up, fine, deal with it. But you don't want to be actually literally coasting into the corner. The bike is not going to feel good. It's not going to feel stable at all. The timing I mentioned before is what you're essentially doing is you're moving your slowing zone, whether it's with the brakes or your engine braking. You're just moving it farther ahead than you have typically if you've not been trail braking. The other thing about this is, again, this is for safety and for stability, is brake early, light, and long. So you don't really need to brake late. I mean, for training, I recommend you kind of brake a little later than you usually do to force you to brake a little past where you usually let off your brakes. But the ideal is that you brake early and you make that transition or the load going to your front tire on the brakes to be as smooth as possible. You always want really smooth ramps of force and not spikes, nothing steep when you can. So how do you do that? Well, if you just use the same brake force you always use, remember muscle memory, I guarantee you if you start trail braking and you start doing this brake early, light, and long, you'll slow down too much because you're used to braking at a particular point at a particular intensity or force. And if you don't adjust that, you're going to end up, if you carry your brakes past where you normally let go of the brakes, you're going to continue to brake and you're going to slow down too much. So you have to adjust and recalibrate the force that you give the brakes to make this work. And plug, but also it's beyond a plug. It's the best place to learn this is on the racetrack, and the non-sport bike day is, where we focus on this stuff. And when riders are new to the track, they typically come down the straightaway because they're like, oh, I get to go as fast as I want, and fine. Well, then they realize they have to slow down for turn one, for the first corner. And more times than not, when they're new to the racetrack, is they shut off the throttle and start braking like really, really early. And then they actually have to get on the gas just to get to turn one, until they work on it and they realize that, oh yeah, my brakes, I can slow the motorcycle down from this speed and I can do it smoothly, and I don't have to get back on the gas. I don't over slow so that I have to get back on the gas just to get to turn one. And so you're moving the brake zone, the slowing zone, to the point where you then calibrate how much intensity you're giving the brakes and where and how long your brake zone is. So this is, again, it's all about practicing it. The knowledge is good, but understand, just don't overthink it. It's about taking your current braking zone and moving it forward and around the corner. Okay, but understand that most people who start doing it, they tend to overslow. It's not a horrible thing, but just understand that that's the reason you're doing that is because you're still using the same brake force that you always do, or you're adjusting it, but not adjusting it quite enough. But sneak up on it. Don't think you're going to be an expert at this right away. And I mentioned before about reducing brake force as you increase lean. So that's part of the timing of this, is that, if you turn in quick, you start to release the brakes quicker, because some corners aren't really, they come in and you turn in pretty quickly. And so if I'm trail braking on a corner that's like that, I'll brake, turn, and I'm immediately kind of starting to release the brakes. So I'll be at that 30% off the brakes, only maybe within 5 feet, of where I start to tip in. It depends on the corner. Long sweeping turns, I brake into them. I probably hold the brakes a little bit. If it's an open turn, then I'm off the brakes pretty early. Probably, it might not even be a trail braking turn if it's a big sweeping turn. So again, every corner is a little different. Smooth and relaxed. Like I said before, if you're not relaxed and you're not smooth and you're rushing, you're doing it wrong. All right. And I'm talking, even if you're looking to keep up with your friends, I don't recommend that. But if you're really wanting, if one of your goals is to start to be a little quicker on the street or wherever, chasing speed is a bad idea. Don't do it. It's all about fundamentals and foundation. Speed will come. It does. It's inevitable. That's why those of you who've taken the non-sport bike track days, first, session out there, you're going rather, sort of slowish. Everybody's kind of figuring things out. By the end of the day, you're going faster. It's not like everybody's just working harder. They're actually working less, but that they're applying the lessons and the speed is coming to them. Okay, Mike, next slide. So this is what most people do. And the red, remembers the slow zone. And then it goes quickly from the red to a little bit of orange, right to the yellow. And the yellow is kind of like you're just coasting. You might be just engine braking, that's fine. But that if you're kind of just doing it because you screwed up your timing, then that's not the technique. So if it's just engine braking, then if this was just engine braking, the color would go from red to an orange to a green. And I'll show you that in just a second. Oh, next slide there, Mike, I'll show it to you now. So first off, this is the same rider, and this is their slow zone. It's this dark area, right? So that's their slow zone. At this point here, the MSF told them they should get off the brakes, and so they do. And then they get into the corner, and hopefully they're at the right entry speed, and they're going to stay off the throttle all the way around the corner until they get to that little green area. Now, the problem with being off the throttle is that the bike doesn't like that. It doesn't really like to be off the throttle while in the middle of a corner. It likes to be driven out. And that means starting to pick up the throttle as soon as you can, safely and smoothly. And that would mean sort of getting that green moved well into the corner. Next slide, Mike. So this is now taking away that brake zone. This is a trail braking line. And now you can see how smooth the color transitions are. The red goes to an orange, and then it goes, there's a little bit of a yellow because the time it takes to go to get off the brakes and then to roll on the throttle, there's a little bit of yellow there. If you use the technique that we teach at the track, but also in the parking lot course, is where you overlap the brakes and the throttle a little bit. So before you're fully off the brakes, you're starting to pick up the throttle, take the slack out of the throttle cable, then that little bit of yellow even starts to disappear. And that's just butter smooth. It really is. Next slide, Mike. So if you remember the last, the MSF guy, I'm going to call him, he had that, his brake zone was that dark area, the dark lane, part of the road, and that's where he ended. But you can see the trail braking goes in and around the corner. So the brake zone now is elongated, it's stretched. You've stretched your brake zone into and around the corner. Now you can go to the intermediate dark area and that would be fine, but you can carry it even a little bit farther if the turn, if it's appropriate. But that's essentially it. It's very simple. Okay, next slide, Mike. So in a decreasing radius turn, now imagine this is a downhill. It's like what I was talking about. You're going to hold on to that brake all the way around until your motorcycle is more or less pointed, to the exit. If you were to get off the brakes too soon, and you're going to be coasting around the corner, decelerating because you're not, you haven't squeezed your clutch in, right? But it's still, the bike doesn't like that. It wants to really start to have some drive. It wants tension in the chassis, in the drivetrain. So you want to at least be at that neutral throttle. Sometimes people call it maintenance throttle. What you're maintaining is your speed, but also your direction of travel. So that you want to have that engaged as soon as you can. Now with a decreasing radius turn like this, I can't get on the gas. Otherwise, if I get on the gas, the bike is going to run wide. It's going to want to point, if I'm pointed toward the outside of the corner of the road, in this case, the oncoming lane, I would have a hard time keeping my bike in my lane. It would want to go into that oncoming lane. So I have to manage the direction control by managing the timing and the intensity of my brakes and throttle. So as the bike comes around, now I can start to pick up the throttle and accelerate out. Because remember, if you accelerate, that's telling the bike that you're done turning, and then it's going to start to stand up. Okay. Okay, Mike, next slide. So this is the Mohawk Trail. It's the famous hairpin. And if we're going from, you can see the big arrows. So we're going to the left, down we're in the right lane. We're not stopping at the Golden Eagle for lunch at the moment. So you can see now you've got the red line, red part of the line. I'm braking. This is downhill. Those of you who know this corner, it's downhill. So I'm going to hold on to that brake, and I've got almost all my slowing is done while I'm straight up and down. By the time I reach that first two, the route 2 symbol, you can see it says both brakes and downshift as you need to. You're going to hold on to the brakes, and then you're going to start to taper off. If you were to taper off the brakes, let's say at the little blue, what do you call it, the little teardrop thing, you're going to still, the bike's going to want to run wide, and it's going to want to run over out past that white line. But where I say taper off the front brake, that's where I'm tapering off. And I'm tapering off the whole time because remember, I'm leaning in. So, but by the time I'm at that arrow that says taper off, I'm now fully off the front brake. Okay, so I've been tapering off the whole time, but now I'm fully off. But I'm still in this orange area, I'm still holding the rear brake. And that's, I mentioned before about why I do that. That's going to help you to refine that entry speed or the corner speed, and then it helps the bike kind of hook around. So experiment with that. It's really a great technique. I mean, I use it all the time, especially if I'm like riding in really intense, like the Alps, hairpin after hairpin after hairpin. If I didn't use this technique, I would just it would wear me out. You have to trail brake. I tell you, if you're going to go any place that's got just even like the Blue Ridge Parkway, the spur roads off of it, trail braking is kind of an essential. if you've ridden it and you've never trail braked, well, good for you, but it would have been way easier and less stressful if you had used trail braking. I got a question here. Do you use the rear brake? I'm going to answer this right now because it's probably timely. Do you use the rear brake trail braking on the track as well? No. Great question. We don't typically use the rear brake at the level that most of us are at. I'm talking even expert track day riders. If you get into expert road racers, they are using the rear brake to a degree. Like MotoGP guys, they've got a thumb rear brake, most of them. And they use it for the same reasons that I use it on the street, and particularly like a downhill turn, is the rear brake kind of squats the bike. So you're controlling the pitch of the motorcycle by braking, by using the rear brake. So that's another thing. It's a whole other conversation about, which I've talked about, and we're going to talk about it as a topic, is which brake and when. And that's what that's about. But for the purpose today, and you look at the diagram, it's the whole red thing is all about slowing, but I'm tapering off, fully tapered off at the arrow where it says taper off brake, but I'm carrying the rear brake a little bit longer. Remember, the rear brake doesn't have a whole lot of power. So at least most bikes, but you have to know your motorcycle, and you have to be able to control that rear brake so that all you're giving it is enough to just bring the bike around and to, keep the motorcycle kind of the speed under control. There are some times that I will actually pick up the throttle, but keep the rear brake on, and that will control any like lurching. And that's really important for really tight turns, or like even like in a parking lot, that if and your bike is snatchy, at the throttle, you can hold it back with the rear brake. And so you go like this. And once you get past the snatch, like the rear brake didn't let the bike go forward, even though, the throttle would have done that, but you're holding the rear brake. And that's the same principle in a corner like this. Is I'll hold the rear brake and I'll start to pick up the throttle, and then I'll ease off the rear brake. And then I smoothly go right down the road. It sounds complicated. It really kind of isn't, but it takes practice. Absolutely. Next slide, Mike. So this is my daughter, Janine. Now we're just trying to graphically show what the timing might be and the intensity of the brakes and the throttle. So here's a corner. Now this is more or less an opening corner. It's an increasing radius. But as she approached it, if she approached it at significant speed, she's going to have to, slow the bike down, but she still doesn't want to be off the brakes straight up and down. She wants to carry the brakes into the lean. But as she comes in about, again, like halfway around the corner, she's now transitioning to the orange, and then to the lime green, and then the green, all the way off to the throttle. But again, it's just seamless. Okay. Next slide, Mike. So this is a more, dramatic series of corners. So the first corner, every corner you want to be driving out of a corner. Now you might say that some corners are really tight, and going from a switchback left and right, you wouldn't necessarily want to get on the gas, and that can happen, but you want to if you can. And that's why I've got that little bit of green between the right-hand turn and the left-hand turn, is that I would be on the gas there. I don't care how short it is, I'll at least give it a little bit of drive, because the bike wants to be driven out of that corner. I always look at these things and go, oh, I would move that green a little bit closer to the bike, which I would do. So she should start to be on the gas about where she is, maybe a little bit farther away from where she is now. But you can see now she goes down the hill, and she goes down at the next corner. She's going to trail brake. That's a tighter turn, the left-hand turn. So she's going to trail brake into there, and then tip in, and same thing, rinse and repeat. All right. Slow in, faster out. Next slide, Mike. Woohoo. So this guy is a typical, an illustration of a typical person who does not really understand the benefits of trail braking and has screwed up the entrance speed. So they'd misjudged the speed. Easy to do. This is the Appalachian Gap. But what the problem is that now he's in this corner faster than he wanted to be. He's about to go off into the oncoming lane. Or he's about to chop the throttle and stab the brakes while the bike is leaned over. He's going to now start dragging parts because of that, because it compresses the suspension. But if he had slowed the bike down, even if he hadn't gotten the bike completely slowed, if he was trail braking or comfortable with it, he would have still been on the brakes. And as he's drifting a little wide, he's like, oh, I still need to slow down more. He would just squeeze the brakes a little bit more. Not a lot, and not jabbing it, because you will lose traction if you're lean too much and you give too much brake force. Next slide, Mike. So there's the line, the graphic line. And you can see he basically, you can almost see a little bit of green on the right as he enters the turn. And that's because he didn't really slow the bike. He wasn't slowing the bike. He was kind of charging into the corner. That's what it looks like when you charge into a corner. And then you screw it up. And then where are you braking? You're braking in the corner when you should be actually on the gas. So that's a really common problem with somebody who just does not understand that they can take the time to get the motorcycle slowed by increasing the distance that your slowing zone into the corner. All right, Mike, next slide. Woohoo. So this is the Alps. This is from a screenshot from a video. Get this out of the way. So this is an example of how the motorcycle, you need to control the speed. This is a downhill, really tight, and you can see that the corner, it hooks around. It actually comes around on itself. It's more than 180 degrees. So the idea is that you get the motorcycle slowed, and you can see the intense red is right up, well, I'm straight up and down. As I tip in, it immediately goes to orange because it's a tight turn. I don't want to be braking hard at that point. So the orange is still braking, but it's lighter. I'm tipped in. I'm already leaned over quite a bit because, again, it's a very sharp turn. So I'm leaned over earlier than if this was a more open sweeping turn. So as I approach the turn, I'm slowing. I can see already where I'm going to start to taper off. I lean in, I taper off, and I smoothly go right onto the throttle. Only when the bike is pointed safely down my lane. Next slide, Mike. And these are videos that are on my YouTube channel. So you can get the links off of ridinginthezone.com, to get to the YouTube channel. But I got all these on there. So, so here's going to the left. Same thing. I'm going to roll off the throttle. This is, again, downhill. So I have to hold on to the brake. And like I was saying before, I would still be on the rear brake just before it turns from orange to lime green. I would be tapering off the brakes fully at that point. Okay, Mike, next slide. That might be it.
That's it.
That's it. Okay. So you can do whatever you want with the screen now, Mike. Actually, why don't you put me up?
Yeah, I'll get there. Keep talking.
All right, I need a drink of water. So what I'd like to hear from you is, what did I miss? What questions or what points did I make that were not clear to you? I mean, I've been teaching this for so long that I kind of can be on autopilot about what I say and how I say it. That doesn't mean it's reached, your ears and in a way that made you understand it. So,
Mimi, the only thing I miss is riding.
Yeah, Mimi was, the fact is that you bring up that point that I mentioned before, is like listening to me talk, reading what I've read, watching my videos. It's all great, excellent, but it really takes the riding to put it into practice. And so, Mike's recording this. I would say review this before you ride next spring. Excuse me. And put it into practice right away. You can do it in the parking lot and say, I do have the 3 parking lot courses scheduled for this summer. And we do it right in the parking lot. And we do it at a higher level than, like an SF class. So.
Looks like you have some questions in the chat.
Oh, I do. Linked brakes. All right, let's do that. Let's see. Okay, let's back up. I can read these chat questions. Okay. Would you suggest beginning to practice on larger curves? Well, here's the thing, is that it will only make sense if you use trail braking on corners that make sense to use trail braking. And so for big corners, they're not necessarily trail braking corners. So if you do that, it's fine to like mess around with braking into a lean. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. But know that all you're doing is you're just trying to like, you know, put your little toe into the water by, you know, using your brakes while you're leaning, which is fine. But you're not going to get the sense of what trail braking does and how it feels until you do it into a corner that's a little bit tighter. Now, again, it's all relative. What's your idea of an open, you know, a larger curve and compared to me, you know, it also depends on your speed. So larger curves are a lot tighter at higher speeds than at slower speeds. So I would recommend I'll say yes to that, but that understand that it's more important that you start to apply it to corners that require or really have the most benefit of trail braking being used. Like I say, we do it on the parking lot, so it's not like you have to go fast. We do it in, you know, as a drill in the parking lot. Linked brake questions. So when I talk about the rear brake, using that separately from the front brake, yeah, you guys really who have linked brakes, you don't really have the complete control of that. It's okay. Don't worry about it. This is a refinement that if I had linked brakes, I wouldn't necessarily miss it. Maybe I would. But remember, linked brakes are also, when you use the rear brake, it's more rear brake than it is front. So if you did release the front brake fully and kept your rear brake on, you're still going to have a rear brake force that's greater than the front. So it's just less of an effect is what's going to happen. You're welcome. Let's see, in the last photo screen grab, would you be tapering entirely off the front brake by the first, like the chevron marker? No, I would still be on the front brake until probably between the second and third one, so 2.5. That's probably when I'll be fully off the front brake. But remember, at that point, I'm at 0 front brake. So at that first chevron, well, I would probably, as I tipped in, I'm now at, say, depends on how quick I have to get into the lean. In this case here, I'll probably be at 60% brakes pretty quickly by the time I'm at that first chevron. By the second chevron, I'm at about maybe 30% brakes. And then between that second and third one, I'm completely off the brakes. But probably in this case, probably carrying the rear brake around a little farther. Great questions. Delayed apexes, absolutely. So that's a whole other topic, is talking about cornering lines. But as a general rule, delayed apexes or late apexes are, they're kind of key. They're really, really important on the street. On the racetrack, same thing. I mean, all the tracks that we ride up here, it's all about decreasing or delayed apexes that are around the corner. You know, if you plan on that all the time, the apex is around the corner, you almost can't go wrong. If you turn in too soon, you're going to be pointed to the outside of a corner. So you have, if you can, like in this diagram that's up here, you can see I'm staying all the way to the white line. I'm staying wide. Yeah, I'm getting kind of close to the guardrail, but I can control my motorcycle. I'm convinced that I won't hit the guardrail, but that keeps me nice and wide so that when I come around, I can, I'm pointed safely down my lane. Let's see. Will this talk eventually be on your YouTube channel? Yes, it will. Oh, hey, Jeff Way. See, where's practice in the summer? I do my all my training in Western Mass. So the parking lot course is in Southwick, which is west of Springfield. It's right off, not right off, but it's near the turnpike in Westfield. The parking lot itself is in Southwick. 10 riders per group. I've got one of the parking lot courses is kind of filling up. So I'm at the racetrack. What are the steps for changing your braking points? Do you change your deceleration and branding? I think braking points at the same time, or one at a time? Which do you change first? That's a complex question. I would have to watch you as you approach. If what you're doing is you're braking too soon, remember that deceleration is your beginning of your slowing zone. So if you are braking, decelerating and braking, what you should do if you're like on the racetrack and you're going down the straightaway is don't suddenly, you know, if like, look at the picture we got here with the chevron signs. We have number boards, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, coming into like the end of a straightaway. If you're used to braking before the 5 board and suddenly you start braking at the 2 board, you're going to scare the crap out of yourself, and you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to, scare yourself. So you would always take small bites, and that's the general recommendation. So the deceleration immediately followed by brakes. So you don't want to decelerate, wait, and then brake. It's all about decelerate and brake. And we want to get everything to be smooth. And the bike always does, it really would rather not be just coasting, even just plain engine braking. It's way more stable if it's got some tension, either brakes or acceleration. Hopeful, thank you, you're welcome. Great info. Ken, what is your opinion on suspension tuning to the rider's weight and bike order to optimize trail braking? I don't worry about that. If your suspension's set up normal, the trail braking is fine. I will say though that on bikes that have really soft suspension, trail braking is actually even more beneficial because of the pogoing. If you do it wrong, you're going to get a lot of fork dive, and then as you get off the brakes and get on the throttle, you're going to get a lot of rebound. So soft suspension, overly soft suspension actually benefits the rider more by using effective trail braking. You're welcome. Is there a relationship between the delayed apex and when you start transitioning from brakes to acceleration? Yeah, well, in that, remember the delayed apex is essentially taking the radius or the shape of the corner, and you're just kind of moving it around. Not only are you taking your brake zone and moving it into the corner, you're taking your line, your apex, and you're moving it around the corner. So in some corners, you're going to, like the one that's up there, you can look at it as a fairly quick drop into the corner. And in this case, it was, especially at speed. If you're not comfortable, counter steering and dropping the bike right on its side quickly, you better slow down because you're going to go off the road. So in this case here, the transition from brakes to acceleration is always going to be when my motorcycle is at the last 85% of the turn. Of the bike is still going to be leaned. It doesn't have to be straight up and down, but remember, as I release the brakes and accelerate, the bike is going to stand up. And the harder you get on the gas, the quicker it stands up. So it's all about that timing and intensity, not only with the brakes, but also with the throttle. Anybody else? Looks like that's all I got here with the chat.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. Those of you who are still here, and join us next Wednesday, same time, same place.
Yeah. And remember, the ridinginthezone.com is it's got all this articles all over the place. You can have the link to the YouTube channel. I got 150 or 200 videos up there. Most of them are instructional, and so there you go. I do have a Patreon page if anybody's interested in supporting. I've got several people who are helping out there, and appreciate that, but no obligation. I love doing this. This is what I do. So any questions that you have or any other topics that you'd like us to tackle, let us know. Okay. All right, Mike, shoot. Finish.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.